Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us tonight for our research event. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you to all of our panelists for being here to answer all of the great questions that were submitted by the attendees. I'm going to start by asking the panelists to go around and introduce themselves. If you want to just tell us your name, where you go to school, and maybe briefly give us like a one line about the type of research experience you've had before med school and in med school, if at all.
In any particular order?
Nope, you can go ahead.
All right. Well, hi everyone. My name is Erwin. I am an MD PhD student at Loma Linda University in California, Southern California. And let's see. So I finished my PhD earlier this year in January. I'm on a slightly untraditional path to the typical MD PhD student who might do like a 3-4-2 setup. I did my PhD first, so I'm starting med school later this year. But before starting grad school, I did like some summer internships for 2 summers. I also did, starting as a freshman, I started doing research at my undergrad with one of my mentors. And so yeah, that's the prior experience I had with research prior to my PhD.
Okay, hi. Hope you guys can hear me. My name is Annalisa Naro. I'm a 4th-year medical student at UT Health Houston. In undergrad, I did immunology research during my junior and senior year. And then in medical school, I've been doing orthopedic research, neurosurgery research, as well as psychiatry research. So I've been kind of all over the place, but I think experiencing different fields makes for a more well-rounded experience. So.
I guess I'll go next. My name is Parker, everybody. Nice to meet you. I am an incoming medical student at the Mayo Clinic School of Medicine in Arizona. During my undergraduate, I did research on dopamine and the reward pathway system. And I did that for about 2 years. And then I also did some clinical research with migraine and preventing headaches. So that's what I did.
Hey guys, my name is Corbin. I am a 3rd year at Pitt. Prior to medical school, I'm a bit non-traditional. I had a 10-year gap in between college and medical school. But in college, I did research primarily around diabetic neuropathy. Now at Pitt, I'm doing a lot of neurosurgery research around deep brain stimulation, as well as radiology research now around 3D printing.
Hey everyone, my name is Luigi. I'm a 2nd-year medical student at Kansas City University in Missouri. I'm also a bit non-traditional as well. I worked for 5 years managing clinical research trials in inflammatory bowel disease before starting medical school. And now I'm currently involved in clinical research in psychiatry and GI.
Perfect. So my name is Abraham Shabaj. I'm a 1st-year medical student at Western University College of Osteopathic Medicine in Los Angeles. So I just came out of class, so forgive me if I stumble a little bit. But so in undergrad at UCLA, I did neuroscience research, just like Parker, where in my case we were using we were taking mice, and then we were putting it into virtual reality and testing the role of the hippocampus. And then after graduating, I worked in ophthalmology, where I managed clinical trials, wrote papers, and then we did a lot of data collecting. And I was able to also present. This time last year, I presented my first conference. And then finally, now in my first year, I've been a part of an immunology lab, and then we'll also be working at a national comprehensive cancer center this summer, the City of Hope, if you know that institution, and then I also was a poster judge at my school, as well as I'll be the incoming research symposium chair. So opportunities with getting posters done. That's something I'll be learning this year.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chasten Brown. I'm an incoming medical student at Des Moines University this fall. I graduated from Utah State University in kinesiology, spent most of my time working with neuromuscular activation and specifically in the context of falls among older adults. So kind of specialized in that kind of thing, but yeah, happy to be here.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Sounds like we have a good kind of array of different interests and experience. So I think for the first question, a couple of you can talk about how do you go about finding a research topic that interests you?
Well, I think that can be a very broadly answered question, but I think it just comes down to you consider the areas or the aspects of science or medicine that you really like or you find interesting or that you're curious about. And from there, you can start developing or seeking out research opportunities that kind of align with that. For me, I'm a microbiologist, and for as long as I can remember, I've always been fascinated, like as a child, by germs. You can't see them, but they're there. It's like a whole other universe. So I kind of knew from the beginning that I kind of wanted to do microbiology. I didn't know it was microbiology at the time, but when I got to college, I found out what it was. It was like, oh, this is what this is.
Yeah, I'd say, especially starting out, I remember when I started out with my first year of undergraduate, I didn't know what I exactly wanted to. I had an idea that I want to do something with neuroscience that aligned with my major and everything. But I feel like, especially those first few years, it's just good to get any experience that you can. It'll start to open up your perspectives, and you'll find out things and learn things that you didn't even realize were there, right? And especially in those first few years when it can be pretty difficult to find a research lab position as an undergraduate, kind of take whatever you can get, I think. And that's not gonna hurt a medical school application at all. If it ultimately didn't align with your interest in cardiology, right? And you started with the brain. But I think, yeah, just starting something. Don't worry too much. I'd say at least about finding your passion at first, because I don't think you'll hit the nail on the head the first time.
And then our next question is kind of asking about how to get started in research, especially if you're someone who has no prior experience. People were asking kind of what's the best way to go about that, or how you guys did personally.
Yeah, so I would say for this one, obviously it's going to vary on, each of our approaches, but my approach in undergrad was I would take advantage of office hours. So I had this one biochem teacher who I wanted to do research with. And I basically would sort of make up a question. It wasn't a genuine question, but it was just a question on like something he taught us about. And then I would go to his office hours, and that was like my way to start our communication together. And basically I would just, ask this question about this, certain topic, and then we sort of go back and forth. And then in that conversation, I would mention like, oh, hey, I'm also interested in research, and I saw you do research in, XYZ. And for me, that is what helped me like get that conversation going. So.
One thing I would say that pertains to people when you're looking for a position is, if there's an open door for you, even if it's something that you may not be interested in yet, take it, because no one opens doors for you in any field and just in general. So when there's an open door and there's an opportunity, you take it, because there's not much. So when someone believes in you, like, hey, join our lab. Like when I first joined neuroscience, like I was not even looking at that lab, and they were just like, why don't you just send an application? I like what you had to say. And it's like, I could have been like, oh no, I'm trying to work with this other professor. Maybe this looks better. No, I took a lot of those skills that I learned from that lab. Even though I'm not interested in neurology in my first time, now I'm focusing more on the hem-onc track. Very much every single little experience that you have is going to keep building and building and building to the point where you will have what it takes to become a research-based physician, or a physician that knows how to read research. It all starts from someone giving you an opportunity. You just start emailing whoever, because first of all, we're going to also validate the feeling. It is very hard to get research as an undergrad. It's very hard. I think everyone here can speak to the amount of rejections you get. So I want to validate that first and foremost. But when there is the opportunity, you take it. You try to get that, because getting that first foot in the door, means someone opened it for you to get that foot into the door. So always don't take everything what we say with a grain of salt, but just make sure that when you have the opportunity, be grateful for it, even though it's not exactly what you think down the line is what you want to do. It's at least a start.
I'll also add on to that, if you're a little bit more interested in clinical research, a few things to sort of be aware of is don't be afraid of rejection. Clinical research can be pretty challenging to get, just because a lot of the times, unfortunately, doctors aren't checking their emails super frequently. So it can seem like you're casting a super wide net, and you might only get 1 or 2 responses, but those 1 or 2 responses can really lead to meaningful experiences that can teach you skills that are transferable to other labs and other research projects. So some strategies that I found for me, especially when I was looking for something more for employment after undergrad, was I was really strategic with how I reached out to different labs and different universities and different departments. So if you can, try to really focus on either getting the program director's contact or the administrative assistant's contact for specific doctors. They're definitely going to be checking their emails a lot more frequently, and we'll get back to you. I will also say as well, if you're able to sort of get in contact with residents, a lot of academic medical centers have a research requirement for the residents. So there's a lot of sort of more, I would say, low intensive projects a lot of the times that residents are working on that they sort of always need help on with things with things there. So if you're not hearing back from the doctors directly, don't get super discouraged on that. Just try to find different people to contact that might be able to sort of see your email and respond to it in a more timely manner throughout your search.
And also one more thing sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just to add to that, if you email once and you don't get a response, I would also suggest, like, maybe in a week or two, send another email, because some, for better or for worse, will tell you after the fact that they actually look for people to send us follow-up email to show that they're actually very interested. I know it seems kind of dumb to do that, but they do. Some do that, and so like not sending that second email could be, they're just not going to look at your first email.
Yeah. This might be a slightly, or need, I would call it a slightly more advanced approach, especially as you maybe get a little bit older, a little bit further in college, as you gain more biomedical knowledge. You can actually use that to inform ideas that you can bring to the table when you go to a research mentor. So when you go to a mentor with an idea, that will grab their attention. I'm telling you, there's probably hardly a mentor who, even if they don't really consider the idea like as realistic, they will like the fact that you took it a step further to say, oh, this is what this lab studies. Maybe there's this, or you see a potential for this gap or this hole in knowledge, and you can bring something to the table. Obviously, things require funding and it might not necessarily be feasible, but it's just showing that enthusiasm and you taking the things to the next step to say, and it could be something simple. It doesn't have to be an extravagant ROI 101 type research grant or anything like that, but it could be something simple to say, well, have you guys ever looked at such and such factor in this and this thing? And that would help, that would go a long way in getting connections.
So I think the only thing that I would actually add on top of that, because I do think that's a solid point, is the fact that even if you have an idea and they say no, they will enjoy the fact that you had an idea. And oftentimes they'll say, well, hey, I got something else happening. Are you potentially interested? I think one of the things too that I would say, because not everybody's comfortable with sending out mass emails to people, even though that's totally fine. A lot of these physicians and scientists, they're in a position where they like they're used to this, so don't feel strange. But still, if you do, another strategy could potentially be to set a time to shadow, right, with a resident and or a physician, and after you've had some time to get that face-to-face time, then use that as an opportunity to just talk about research on the spot, right? That way it's a bit more personal, if that's something that may feel a bit more comfortable for you.
So I know that some of our panelists took some gap years or were non-traditional students. I think we have some people in the audience who are interested in understanding more about how to pursue research during your gap years, or if you're non-trad and are not don't have the connections of a university or something like that, how you can get involved in research in that stage.
For me, I knew that I wanted to get involved with research, specifically clinical research, because at least at the time when I was graduating, I knew I wanted to work in healthcare, but I didn't know if I wanted to do that as a physician, as a PA. So I was really, sort of wanting to be in a hospital setting so I could sort of see how different healthcare workers sort of worked with the team. So I was sort of more focused towards that clinical research in order to gain me that experience. I also will say I didn't have really any connections going into sort of this search, which was super overwhelming. I think I sent over 100 emails and only got 2 responses. So definitely, heeding the advice that we were talking about to sort of really get your name out there is definitely key. A good sort of time to reach out would be around this time within the next few weeks. And the reason why is because that's when a lot of research labs, especially on the clinical side, will be experiencing a lot of turnover with people who are previously in the labs starting medical school. So that's sort of, honestly, at least in my experience, really the only times, or one of the only times, that they're really looking at applications. And a lot of the times it's really who contacts first come, first serve. So if you contacted in December and they said that, we'll keep your application on file, contact them again around this time now, just so that you sort of get bumped back up in the priority list. I would say that when you're reaching out, especially for employment, you really want to structure your CV around skills that are going to be worthwhile and make you a standout candidate for that position. So for clinical research specifically, it's a lot of managing different pieces, managing different patients, and also having a high level of organizational skills. So if you have any previous experience that sort of highlights that, really make sure that you're crafting that when you're presenting yourself to the research lab, because that's really what they're going to look for, because it's what the job requires. So yeah.
So I would be very transparent and say that, hey, I think will give all props to Luigi. I am a non-traditional student. I was a hospital administrator for 10 years. and my life just didn't allow me to do anything else, right? I mean, but run a hospital, to be honest. But I always knew that, at least for me, that, very unsure additional route would bear fruit for medical schools. I like always knew they would be highly fascinated by it. And I knew that the opportunity would come again for me to get involved with research. But that's not to say, just as he did, right, just send out those emails.
I also will say too, especially for clinical research, because that's what my experience was in, it honestly was sort of the centerpiece of my application, just because I was lucky in my position where I was really given a lot of responsibility and sort of treated as part of the healthcare team. So with our research patients, I was, in communication with our physicians, our nurses, and our mid-level providers, sort of helping guide the clinical decisions, and even to the point of conducting my own clinic visits for our research patients, which really, really taught me about clinical competency and gave me sort of a reason of why medicine as a physician. So, which is a huge question that a lot of adcoms are really going to want you to have an idea of when you're applying to medical school. So if you are thinking of being employed in research, especially for those gap years, and clinical might be a little bit more interesting to you or something that you want to pursue, really try to be selective when it comes to the type of clinical research that you are choosing, because clinical research is not a one size fits all. Perfect example in my experience, I had one position which I ended up taking, which was fantastic, and I had constant patient interaction, face-to-face interaction, and also a lot of responsibility. And the other position I was offered was just sitting at a computer and just filling out an Excel spreadsheet with no patient interaction. So you really also want to look for research positions that are going to highlight specific skills that you want to accumulate and sort of master before you're applying to medical school.
So our next question is asking about the difference between clinical versus basic science research, and kind of deciding between those two, is one better than the other, and kind of the differences.
I'll go ahead and speak on that. At its core, because I was sitting here thinking, I don't know, maybe I got a little bit too philosophical with it, but like, why is it really that research is required? Why is it that people clamor, or people are wanting to do, or why are medical schools looking for like research experience in the first place? And in all honesty, what I concluded in my mind, at least, was that it really comes down to the skills that you take from being a researcher. And that is to think critically, to be able to look at a problem and say, okay, how am I going to solve this? How are you going to process and analyze and interpret your data? How are you going to troubleshoot things? And in all honesty, you get that both in a clinical setting and a basic science setting. I mean, there are basic scientists who would wrestle you and tell you that clinical research doesn't compare in caliber to basic science research. I don't really see it that way. I just kind of see it how I said. The way I looked at my PhD, because my project was, for all intents and purposes, it was mostly a basic science research process, dissertation thesis. So, and I know people would have like stuff to say about that when being in the PhD and stuff. But in all honesty, I looked at my PhD as something that I just did to take the skill set, the scientific way of thinking, of solving problems. And I think that applies to whether or not you've done basic science, whether or not you've done clinical. So try to view it from that lens. Think about the experience and what you're getting from it, and how it's going to apply to you as a physician in your career as you go forward, not just to cross it off to say, oh, check, I did research, because that's what you need to do to get into school.
Yeah, I think there's been a few different adjectives that we used like a lot already, like passion, enthusiasm. And I think those come into play a lot with this kind of topic of like, where should I go? What's the difference between what am I going to be doing? And I was more like on the applied science side of things, right? So with falls and older adults, I kind of tied that into more of my personal connections. Like my father-in-law has MS, and so he has limited mobility, and my grandma, she's fallen and broken both of her hips actually. So it kind of tied into my passion. And so I was like, okay, applied science, like this is where I can really craft that story in my medical school application to like, this is something I really care about. But it's also helping me gain those skills, just like Erwin just kind of explained. So I think it all kind of plays a part. But those are kind of those adjectives that we keep bringing up. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, I'd also point out there are some strong differences, I guess, with the level of patient interaction that you might see versus from clinical to basic sciences. At least in my experience, I started with basic science research, and we were using rodents and injections, and there were a lot of just long hours in the lab kind of by myself. But when I did the clinical research, I was interacting with patients. I was talking with them, getting their experience and stuff like that. And personally, I enjoyed that more. I liked the interaction, the talking with patients more. So that might be something to consider too. But I know you can also find that with basic science research too. So it goes kind of back to just kind of what you think might fit your personality more. I don't think either is necessarily better for a medical school application. I know I got asked by adcoms about both of them. And in particular, I got asked like, more of why did I do that? Or what did I take away from each of them? Not did I like one over the other more. It was just more, what did I learn? So that's the big takeaway, I'd say.
And then just to touch on that point, like what interviewers are looking for, especially even when it comes time for residencies and all that, it's not just that checkbox. And I think Erwin like really touched on this, where there's these little skills about how you're going to adapt this into becoming a physician. And for me, when I'm saying about research, I'm not going to go crazy with like these insane trials. It's more or less I'm going to start to see patients. In the next few years, I'm going to start to see patients. And you're trying to learn how to be a great observer, a great analyst, and someone that can take what they're seeing and constantly improve. The medical schools are all looking for lifelong learners. And learning is not just by the books, just trying to regurgitate facts. It's how do you take what you're learning and for your whole life try to figure out ways to improve the world around you. And that's research. You take what's around you. So when you're doing your basic sciences research, you're learning those little skills here and there. It's not just a checkbox. If you're just doing it as a checkbox, then there's other things in medicine that will be your passion. So it is important to be part of research, but if it's not your passion, that's totally okay. Like you don't, and it's a waste of your time if you're not there for the right reasons. And it's also, so I would say when it comes time, like difference between basic sciences and clinical, basic sciences, you're really learning they give you the groundwork. And then once you get into medical school, like that's when a lot more opportunities in clinical medicine come onto play. And that's where you take what you learned so far in your classes and start to think and observe and say, what do I see? And then when you get into residency, it's always the same thing. You're just fine tuning the way that you think. And that's what medical schools are trying to identify is this person someone that will constantly be someone that's going to always ask questions, someone that's going to look to answers, and maybe have the motivation and urge to be able to say, how am I treating? Is that something that's going to help me, that is going to help the patients in the long run? Like, how do I fine tune my treatment? How do I make sure that the care I'm giving is the best that I can do? A lot of those come down to giving the right medical medications through, and that comes from clinical trials, different treatment options. So for me, it's like, say it's in chemotherapy, that has to do with a lot of different long FDA trials and experiments just to get to the point of being constant, just to say this medication is going to be better for you. So research is a really big groundwork of it. And being a physician, you don't need to necessarily be a researcher. You have to be someone that will work in line with research. So basic sciences, you may not be interested in it, but you want to be interested in the skills that you take from it?
Yeah, just to piggyback off of that slightly too, because when you look at medicine currently, the way that things are moving is more of an integrated kind of approach between basic science and medicine. You'll hear like terms like translational research, excuse me, like, and that just means translating things directly from the bench to the clinic. And so there's more and more progressively more and more integration between the two. And so you as a physician in this day and age will have to, in some way or another, be not necessarily directly involved, like Abraham said, but just aware enough to know your way around like research and implications, even contributing wherever possible. Even if you just volunteer to like get patient data or whatever and give it to like a research team, whatever the case is, that's just the way that medicine is heading.
Next, we have some questions about publications in research and the importance of getting published with your research, whether it's worth taking on opportunities where you may not get publications out of it, or if you should be looking for things that could potentially lead to publications, especially in the pre-med phase of the med school journey.
I'll just say I didn't get published at all during undergrad, so it didn't affect my cycle. I still got an acceptance, and so you work hard, and publications will come when they come. But yeah.
I was gonna say the same too. It's really at that stage as an undergrad. If you're published, great. If you're not, it's okay, because admission committee members, they know that it's mostly about quality over quantity, really, at that point. If you had a research experience, if you can talk about what that meant to you, how you learned from it, how you grew from it, how you're going to apply those things, like that's much more golden than necessarily the publication, because typically the time that you spend in doing those research experiences, it might not be long enough for you to generate enough work to warrant an authorship, or to be as significantly involved with the project. And if it does, great, that's great. It's just a cherry on top. But I also didn't publish before I got into the MD PhD program here, so it's not super 100% necessary.
Yeah, I will say when you're interviewing for medical school, the biggest thing they're looking for is how well you can talk about your research, and just sort of the passion that exudes from you when you talk about it, rather than publications. Because again, I'm going to add on to them. I also didn't get published in undergrad. That is something that more so matters in medical school. So if you're an MS1 or MS2 on this call, maybe that'll pertain more towards you. But I will say in undergrad, it's not as important. Again, it's just more, like he said, quality over quantity, and how passionate you were about the projects that you were in.
I completely agree with what everyone said. I really think that the transferable skills are really the most important part, and the passion that you're able to exude when talking about the research, because that really shows the outcomes that you did something that you cared about and you also gained a lot from it. However, I will say, if you are super focused on wanting to get a publication, or at least, working in a lab that gives you some of the skills, if they're like working on a publication or they've published in the past, if you are interested in clinical research, do be careful about the different types of research labs or departments that you are joining. So mine 100% actually worked with pharmaceutical companies instead of investigator-led studies. We had a few here and there, but they weren't super sort of gung-ho about publishing those research studies. So for us, a lot of pharmaceutical research, you can't really, there's no space to publish on, just because those things are very tightly regulated and there's just not really a lot of room for collaboration at the individual level. However, I will say, like I mentioned earlier, even though I didn't publish through my lab, it was sort of the highlight of my application, and I talked about it for sort of 90% of my interviews. So just because an experience doesn't lead to a publication doesn't mean that it could provide you sort of the highlight of an application when applying to medical school.
Yeah, and I just want to quickly echo what Annalisa said, being able to talk about your research. If you're mentioned as an author or in a presentation on a poster, like at least know what it is, because sometimes people will do, different varieties of a project, but be able to talk about it. Because if they ask and you don't know, then that's a little iffy.
Yeah, so sometimes you might see people getting published where they might have just did some editing or proofreading, or if the primary authors were non-native English speakers, they helped them to fix the English in the manuscript and things like that. I've seen people get published in instances like that. And if you do happen to get published, just what Chasten said, you have a responsibility as an author of that paper to know what the project is going to be about. Because if somebody, looks you up on PubMed or whatever, Google Scholar, and they ask you about this project, you don't want to be left looking kind of silly, for a lack of a better word. You can't talk about a publication that you were on. So, yeah, quality over quantity again.
I think a good follow-up question to that we received was asking about how to have a conversation with your PI about authorship, especially like primary authorship, if it's something that you worked a lot on, and how to kind of bring those things up as it's getting time to submit for publication.
In my experience with this, I was very forthright when contacting. This was more while I ended up having a publication before applying to medical school, but it was in a completely different department. It was actually public health research, because I have a vested interest in public health. And my approach, which ended up being super beneficial, was being very straightforward with the PIs as I was reaching out to them. So I didn't necessarily say like, I need a publication, like, please give me one. But the way I sort of phrased it was that I let them know that I was really, really interested in establishing skills that revolved around publication, including data management, including how to process that data, perform literature reviews, even meta-analyses, things like that. So I sort of framed my outreach in terms of the skills that I wanted to learn that would lead to a publication. And I actually had feedback that was a sort of good approach to take, because it showed initiative and I was sort of willing to work on a project that required the steps necessary to lead to a publication. So I would say try being straightforward about it and try really emphasizing that you are interested in learning the skills required to publish a research paper, because in my experience, PIs sort of like that initiative, and it also shows that you are willing to be a learner, like we've talked about on this call already, and take on that responsibility.
Yeah, I agree with that, with everything Luigi shared. I just want to add as well that you'll find PIs with different ideologies surrounding authorship. It's kind of like this it can be a touchy subject in some circles, depending on where you are. My own experience, my PI, they were very partial when it came to authorship on papers. She had a very strong stance that if you didn't contribute intellectually to a paper, that you didn't deserve authorship on that paper, even if you may have done like some work that was related to some of the data that was used in the paper. You might get to the acknowledgements, but you wouldn't get an authorship if you didn't intellectually contribute to the experimentation, design, and the writing of the paper. So much so that I did a rotation in her lab one summer, and from my eyes, this is when I was an undergrad, I thought that I did in those 8 weeks. I thought I did the world, the most work possible. We screened something like 120,000 clones, and I generated constructs that no, even the postdoc in the lab wasn't able to. I guess I just had like some beginner's luck or something. And at the end of it, our genomic library screen didn't turn out any positive hits, even though it was negative data. I thought it was still, it did go into the paper in some way, but she thought that I didn't contribute intellectually to the project. And because of that, I just ended up in the acknowledgements. I'm still very salty about that to this day, as you can tell. But yeah, so it varies from place to place. On the other hand, I did a rotation in graduate school, which are required when you first start. They require you to rotate at least through 2 labs. I did a rotation in a lab that does neuroscience research, and I decided against that lab because I didn't like euthanizing the mice. I went back to my bacteria, my first love. But out of that 3-month rotation in that lab, guess what? I got an authorship. But most of what I did was analyzing data and generating some tissue sections for IHC staining. So it varies from PI to PI.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I would probably top that off with as well is because there's so much variation from a person to person. I think Luigi also mentioned it, right? I mean, for lack of better words, just have the conversation, right? Have it just find out from the PI what is their philosophy around authorship. It will save you in the long run. I know a lot of folks who got burned pretty hard. They did a lot of work, but they didn't make first authorship, or they came in at the end of the paper. And so I think the more transparent you are, it may be uncomfortable, but chances are, if you're in a phase where you're talking about doing a first authorship kind of paper, this isn't the first project that you're doing, or it's not the first one that you're doing with a particular person, right? So don't be afraid to have that conversation.
I just kind of want to piggyback into that because Corbin Irwin, they really touched on something really great is, and also I want to shout out to what Alex is saying in the chat too. Make sure to check out the chat because you want to have these conversations and you want to, and as you say, it varies between PI to PI. You need, in anything, you have to make a working relationship. What does that mean? You have to be honest about what you're looking for in a really respectful way and show that you're willing to put in the time and willing to push yourself to contribute to whatever project is and what that could lead to in a publication. So a lot of times it's like you want to just start work with your PIs, start to see if there's one little project and another and another. So ultimately there is trust, and sometimes a lot of times, yeah, you get gypped. You get gypped by the PI, and just that's just how it goes with work in general. So it really just, and then, but that doesn't mean that that opportunity is like the end. You can, there will be some other person that will recognize the work that you did, and then that will lead to an even better opportunity. So yes, there was like, even in undergrad, like I didn't have any publications really coming into medical school, like really big ones, because when I first worked in my neuroscience lab, I found something and I just didn't communicate early on because I was just a little still learning. And I found something, and apparently I was trying to figure out if I could get research or publication, and it just didn't work out. So I had to also value my time. It's very much you are working, you want to build a working relationship with someone. That means you respect your time just as much as you respect their time and how you contribute to the lab. So have those conversations early. Make sure that you are clear about what you want to do, what you want to accomplish with the goals of the lab. And then you'll figure out if it's a fit. And then ultimately you'll start to develop relationships that will just keep building and building into better things.
Yeah, and I think one thing that helps that, like keeping those communication lines open, not being afraid to ask for help in the future, right? Like a PI is not just going to assume that you know everything, that you're going to be able to work through everything without any hiccups, right? So being willing to ask for help, you say like the three hardest things to say, or I'm sorry, or what is it? I'm wrong. I need help, and Worcestershire sauce, or something like that. But like, just be willing to ask for help because they'll be there.
So we have another question asking about the writing process involved in research. If there's any resources that you all used, especially when you were writing manuscripts or abstracts for the first time, and kind of adjusting to that process and what that was like.
You can look at something that helps is if you look at past publications from the laboratory and kind of just get a feel for how they write specific, like how they refer to specific things and terminology and things like that. Obviously, from that also you're going to get the layout and things that you should be including in each section and things like whatnot. And it's not as hard as you think because you've been prepared for this from with your like lab reports that you had to write in undergrad and even high school and things like that even. So it's really just more an exaggerated version of that. You just best advice. My best advice would be to just look at the past, see what they've done, and worst, you can always ask someone else in the lab for tips or advice on how you should approach like certain things within the manuscript.
One approach that I had success with, but I don't know if I would totally endorse it just because of how time consuming it was. I took a paper and I read through it, and then I basically tried to make a poster presentation out of it, and then take like those simple points from a poster and put it into an abstract. And that was like the one abstract that I didn't get back with like 60% red lines from from the postdoc. So I don't know, it was really time consuming, but that one seemed to work really well, especially with flow and things like that.
Yeah, and I will say when it comes to writing, at the end of the day, I think what they're looking for is that you're putting in the effort. I know in my case, whether I spent hours and hours or I try to just write it up really quickly, like in terms of an abstract, every time I sent it to my PI, they would always send it back with a ton of edits. So I think really it's just showing that you're willing to put in the effort and put in the time. And then, obviously they're going to edit it. They're going to change a lot of what you write. But as long as you're contributing, usually they'll be happy to put you on the paper or put you, as a first or second author. It just depends on your contribution. But again, it starts with the effort. So just don't be afraid to try.
We also have some questions from people who are either not near an academic hospital or a research center, and from people who are international students asking about remote opportunities or how they can get involved if they're not near somewhere where they could go in person to kind of find those opportunities.
So
I
the
will
big,
say,
so
sorry.
Luigi, you go first. You go first, Luigi.
Oh, sorry, it was quick. All I was going to say is like a lot of clinical research looks at patient outcomes or different outcomes for different procedures, medications, whatever. A lot of those are actually they're remote anyways. So even like right now I'm doing 2 research projects at medical centers that are within like 2 miles from me, and I haven't gone in once because they've been completely remote. So I will say a lot of the clinical stuff, you have sort of a little bit more wiggle room in terms of geographic restrictions. It does require a lot of like online training and things like that to make sure that you are sort of up to date with the confidentiality agreements and stuff, and all the things that sort of entail when it comes to virtual data that is HIPAA protected. But I will say the clinical stuff typically has a lot more wiggle room for the geographic geographic stuff.
So I'm gonna let you in all on a cheat code. It's called lit reviews and case reports. So a lot of times with you'll start to see that you won't have time in medical school. You won't have that much time to dedicate towards a huge project that will be a huge publication. So when you have those first 1 or 2 years, what's kind of worked for us is like a lot of times a second or a third or a fourth year will initiate a paper of some sorts, and you start to get sections and publications. So that isn't, and it's not even just like limited to just your school. Someone could post it on some other job siting or something. You just have to just keep an eye out, and then the opportunity will show itself. Very much is something where you're going to that's something where it's easy, it's remote, and it's very much something can be dispersed among a lot of people. Specifically the second or third years will just disseminate that to first years to write a good chunk of the paper. So like currently I have a deadline due in a week for a lit review, and it's just a matter of just timing yourself with everything that you're doing to make sure that you get the sections done that you can. So it's not like you have to write a whole publication just yourself. Research is also collaborative, not just in a lab setting, but also in the writing process. You can get other people to chime in, say, does this sound correct? Is this right? How should I approach this? It is very much something where you could, and with COVID, I don't want to say COVID helped things because nothing about COVID was great, but one of the things it did open up a lot more remote opportunities and making collaboration online a much more big commonplace. So for anyone international, or like for me, there's no academic institution, like a huge like academic like hospital near me, but you can just kind of look and see that there's some students that are trying to figure out a project, and so you just kind of latch onto that.
So I think it was mentioned in the chat, and I would also agree, the power of statistics will always, I think that was Alexander. If you have a skill set like statistics, you are a rich resource for any provider, any scientist, for anything, right? I mean, somebody who can do their own data analysis, when to use the right tests, that will always keep you busy. Thankfully, over the past 10 years, that is a skill that I developed. And I've been back to back, to be honest, until I took my break for step one studying. The thing that I would also add for international medical students, I think a good strategy that you can use if you're already a physician, right? Join the association for whatever specialty you may be interested in. That it gives you some great access to a network of folks who would more than likely take a chance on you, right? Just knowing that you may be a part of, the association. I do have a lot of friends who went to medical school outside of the US and have tried to just cold email folks, and it's a bit challenging. I won't say it's the easiest thing to do, but when you can do things like find some kind of a commonality, right, with a scientist, that certainly would help. Just to add on as well, there was a question about how you can develop a stats skill set. To be honest with you, you just gotta go online, teach yourself, read papers. You'll see some of the techniques and so forth that they use. But whether it's Stata or SAS or R, right? These are all statistical softwares that, to be honest with you, if you just spend a few days on YouTube mixed with some good reading of the literature, you can teach yourself quite a bit.
I'll just take this moment to say that I do have to go right now. Sorry about that, but I left a message in the chat where you guys can find my contact info, as well as there's a resource that really helped me when I was in college looking for opportunities. As in, I was an international student in college, and it's the website that I shared there. You can put a filter for the research opportunities in regards to residency requirements and stuff. This is for the people asking about like international students asking about opportunities and whatnot. Feel free to reach out at any point in time, but I do have to go. But thank you everyone for your great questions, and I hope you guys have a great remainder of this session.
Thanks for joining us, Erwin. We appreciate it. I think with that, we'll just have one more question about more geared towards medical students. Some people asked about research opportunities as med students and also the option of taking a research year. If any of our panelists have experience with that or have considered that or know more about those types of opportunities, I can speak to that a little bit.
So I think, to be honest, most schools do allow you the ability to do a research year. I contemplated it for a hot minute, but then my wife reminded me I'm a bit old and I need to just continue straight on. But I think it varies from school to school, right? Some schools may have, a good structure around it. I know for me at Pitt, we're like really huge on research. It's mandatory just for the average student, but we also have like a plethora of avenues that you can go to take off a year. So you can choose between your second and third year or your third and fourth year. And they will also help you with funding. I think that's a thing that I think may be a challenge for a lot of folks, right? I mean, especially if you're not in a very structured setting, how do you fund your research for a year? There are a lot of programs, right? I mean, and I'm sure you probably, for the specialty or subject matter that you may be interested in, with a quick search online, you probably can find some grant for, doing some kind of research. But I would say, is it necessary? It all depends, right? I think there are two trains of thought, at least that I've encountered. One being, if you're just passionate about it and you say, hey, I'm in medical school and I want to take some time off to do a research just because I enjoy it, by all means. I think medical education is structured in such a way where, to be honest with you, after medical school, life doesn't get any easier. So it's like, hey, if you have the time and the wherewithal to take a break, by all means, take that break if you're passionate. And then there are, I think, like there are a few specialties where, if you find it late, right? Like if you come across, you're at the end of your third year and you say, hey, all of a sudden, I want to do derm or neurosurgery, orthopedics, ENT, right? Where it's like, yeah, you got to have a robust research CV especially with step one being now pass fail, it would probably behoove you to take some time off. But otherwise, if it's a case where, you felt like you were doing the right thing as a student, you found, your passion relatively soon, it's not a necessity.
Awesome. Thank you guys. I think with that, we can wrap up here. I don't want to take any more of your time, but thank you to our panelists for being here and for having such great, insightful advice for everybody, and for the attendees for submitting all these great questions. I hope tonight was helpful. And if anyone has any further questions or wants to reach out to anyone, we're all in the Slack community, and I'm sure are always happy to answer any further questions. So thanks everyone for coming tonight.